At 11 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns of the First World War went silent. 20 million people were dead. Empires had been wiped off the map, and the survivors looked at the wreckage of the world and swore the same two words: humanity always swears after it does something this stupid. Never again. It lasted 20 years, because the people who ended that war didn't just end it. They wrote a peace treaty so cruel, so humiliating, so perfectly designed to break Germany that they basically handed the next war an engraved invitation. Last time I told you how the world fell into the deadliest war it had ever seen. I was wrong about one thing. It hadn't seen anything yet. This is the story of how a broke, starving, furious Germany found a man with a small mustache and a big grievance, and how the entire planet sleepwalked, step by step, eyes open, straight back into hell, and then had to claw its way out at a cost that makes the First War look like a rehearsal. This is World War II. Let's go back to 1909. The war is over, and the winners, France, Britain, America, sit down at the Palace of Versailles to decide Germany's punishment. And France, who had just watched an entire generation of its men die in the mud, was not in a forgiving mood. The treaty was brutal. Germany lost its land, lost its colonies. Its army was capped at 100,000 men, no air force, no tanks, no submarines. And then came the part that really stung, the war guilt clause. Germany had to sign a piece of paper accepting that the entire war was its fault, all of it, and because it was officially their fault, they got the bill. Reparations so enormous that one British economist in the room, John Maynard Keynes, walked out and basically said, "This isn't a peace, this is a setup for the next war." He was right. Germany's economy didn't just struggle, it detonated. By 1923, the money was so worthless that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People burned cash to heat their homes because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Savings, gone. Pensions, gone. An entire middle class wiped out overnight, holding wheelbarrows of paper money that couldn't buy lunch. And here's the thing about desperate, humiliated, broke people. They don't want a careful politician with a sensible 10-point plan. They want someone who points at the wreckage, points at a villain and says, "None of this is your fault, it's theirs, and I will make them pay." Enter the man. Adolf Hitler was an Austrian failed painter and a World War I veteran who took Germany's defeat personally. He latched onto a poisonous lie already spreading through the country, that Germany's army was never actually beaten on the battlefield, that it had been stabbed in the back by traitors and politicians and Jews at home. It wasn't true. But it didn't have to be true. It just had to feel true to people who needed someone to blame. In 1923, he tried to seize power by force, failed spectacularly, and went to prison. And honestly, that should have been the end of him. Instead, he sat in his cell and wrote a book laying out exactly what he planned to do: destroy democracy, expand east, eliminate the Jews. And Germany, for a few good years, ignored him. The economy recovered. Extremists got boring. Then, 1929. The American stock market crashed, the Great Depression went global, and Germany, which had been propped up by American loans, collapsed a second time. 6 million unemployed. And suddenly, the angry man who'd been screaming on street corners didn't sound so crazy anymore. He sounded like the only one with answers. Now, here's the part most people get wrong. Hitler didn't seize Germany in a violent coup. He was handed it. His party became the biggest in parliament through actual elections, and in January 1933, the old president appointed him chancellor, figuring they could control him. They could not control him. Within weeks, the parliament building mysteriously burned down. Hitler blamed the communists, demanded emergency powers, and used them to ban every other party, crush every opponent, and make himself absolute dictator. He didn't smash democracy from the outside. He walked in through the front door and locked it behind him. Remember that part. It matters more than any battle in this whole story. So now Hitler has Germany, and he wants the one thing Versailles forbade, an army. So he just builds one, tanks, an air force, 500,000 men, all completely illegal under the treaty. And the world's response? Nothing. This becomes a theme. Hitler marches troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, with secret orders to retreat instantly if anyone pushes back. Nobody pushes back. He's bluffing, and he keeps winning, because Britain and France are traumatized. They remember the last war. They'll do almost anything to avoid another one, so they invent a strategy with a polite name, appeasement, which mostly meant giving the bully your lunch money and hoping he gets full. He didn't get full. In 1938, he marches into Austria and annexes the entire country, his homeland, without a shot. Then he eyes Czechoslovakia, demanding a border region full of ethnic Germans. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flies out, desperate to keep the peace, and at a conference in Munich, Britain and France simply give it to him. Hand over a chunk of someone else's country on Hitler's promise. Pinkies swear that he's done now. Chamberlain flew home, waved a signed piece of paper at the cameras, and announced, "Peace for our time." Crowds cheered. 6 months later, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. The paper meant nothing. It never did. Churchill, watching from the sidelines, put it best. They were given the choice between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor, and they will have war. Next target, Poland. But Hitler had a problem. Poland's east bordered the Soviet Union, and Hitler despised the Soviets and their communism. Everyone assumed the two would never deal. Everyone was wrong. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the planet by signing a non-aggression pact. Two sworn enemies shaking hands. Why? Because secretly, they'd agreed to do the one thing that benefits any two predators: split the prey. They were going to carve up Poland and take half each. On September 1st, 1939, over 1 million German troops poured into Poland. New strategy, terrifying to watch. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks punch through, planes scream overhead, everything moving so fast the enemy can't even react before they're surrounded. And here's where I have to stop and kill a myth, because every documentary repeats it. You've heard that the Poles were so backward they charged German tanks on horseback with lances. It's nonsense. It's literally Nazi propaganda. Here's what actually happened. On day 1, Polish cavalry, who were mounted infantry, armed with rifles and anti-tank guns, ambushed and scattered a group of German foot soldiers. It worked. Then German armored cars showed up and forced them to retreat. The next day, German officers brought Italian journalists to the field, pointed at the dead horses lying near some tanks that had rolled up after the fight, and spun a fairy tale about stupid Poles charging steel with swords. The world believed it for 70 years. Now you know better. The Poles fought hard, but attacked by Germany from the west and stabbed by the Soviets from the east, they never had a chance. Britain and France had promised to protect Poland, so they declared war on Germany. And then, they did almost nothing. For months, soldiers sat in their fortifications staring across the border while Poland was crushed. People called it the phony war, the calm before everything. Then, in spring 1940, Hitler turned west, and the calm ended. France thought it was ready. It had built a massive wall of fortifications, the Maginot Line, along its German border. Impenetrable. There was just one gap, a dense forest called the Ardennes, which French generals swore no army could pass through. Too thick, too difficult. So naturally, that's exactly where Germany sent its tanks. 40,000 vehicles came pouring through the impassable forest, popped out behind the French defenses, and raced for the sea, cutting off the best of the British and French armies and pinning them against the beaches of a little port town called Dunkirk. 400,000 Allied soldiers, trapped, backs to the water, the German army closing in. This should have been the end. Capture all of them, and Britain has no army left. What happened next, the British still talk about today. With the Navy unable to reach the shallow beaches, a call went out, and civilians answered. Hundreds of little boats, fishing boats, ferries, pleasure yachts, ordinary people sailing across the channel into a war zone to ferry soldiers home, a few dozen at a time. Against every expectation, they pulled over 30,000 men off those beaches. They lost the equipment. They saved the army. It was a defeat dressed up as a miracle, but it meant Britain could keep fighting. Weeks later, Paris fell. France surrendered. The country that had held the Germans for 4 brutal years in World War I collapsed in 6 weeks. And just to twist the knife, Italy's dictator Mussolini, Hitler's new best friend, declared war and piled on at the end, eager for a share of the spoils. By the summer of 1940, Hitler ruled Europe, and only one country was left standing against him, Britain. Alone, an island with a battered army, one channel of water away from a dictator who'd conquered a continent. Hitler assumed Britain's new prime minister, a stubborn old warhorse named Winston Churchill, would see the math and surrender. Instead, Churchill went on the radio and growled that they would fight on the beaches, fight in the fields, fight in the streets, and never surrender. So Hitler decided to invade. But to cross the channel, he first had to control the sky, destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. What followed, fought entirely in the air over southern England, was the Battle of Britain. And on paper, it was hopeless. The German Air Force massively outnumbered the British. But Britain had 2 things: radar, a brand new invention that let them see the bombers coming and aim every precious fighter exactly where it was needed, and motivation. Because a German pilot was fighting for conquest, but a British pilot was fighting for his actual home, his family, the streets below him. Then Hitler made a mistake that probably saved Britain. After some German bombers accidentally hit London, Britain bombed Berlin in return. Hitler, humiliated and furious, ordered his air force to stop attacking the airfields and flatten London instead, which was horrifying for London. Night after night of bombing, the Blitz, families sleeping in subway stations. But it took the pressure off the airfields at the exact moment they were about to break. The RAF recovered, fought back, and shattered the German assault. For the first time, Hitler had lost. The invasion was cancelled, and a man who couldn't beat a single stubborn island made the worst decision of the entire war. He turned around, looked east, at his ally, the Soviet Union, and decided to invade the largest country on Earth, June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German and Axis troops, the largest invasion in human history, smashed across the Soviet border. Hitler had torn up his own pact and stabbed Stalin in the back, betting he could crush the Soviet Union before winter, the same way he'd crushed everyone else. And at first, it worked terrifyingly well. The Germans drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. But the Soviet Union is enormous. And this is the part where the war stops being about clever tactics and starts being about something darker. Because as the German army advanced, special killing squads followed behind it, and what began here would become the most systematic mass murder in human history. We'll come back to that. Hold on to it. The Germans pushed all the way to the gates of Moscow. They could see it, and then the thing every invader of Russia forgets about finally arrived. Winter. Not normal winter, Russian winter. Temperatures so low that engine oil froze solid, that guns wouldn't fire, that soldiers froze to death in summer uniforms because Hitler had been so sure of a quick victory he never sent winter coats. And as the Germans froze inside of Moscow, Stalin brought in fresh troops from Siberia, men built for this cold, and threw them at the exhausted invaders. The Germans, for the first time on land, were stopped, then pushed back. The unstoppable army had finally hit something it couldn't beat. And meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the war was about to get a brand new player. The biggest one of all, this whole time. Through Poland, through France, through the Blitz, one country had stayed out of it. The United States. After the horrors of the First World War, America wanted nothing to do with Europe's mess. They'd sell weapons to Britain, sure. But send their sons to die overseas again? No chance. That changed in one morning. The problem was on the other side of the world. The Japanese Empire was expanding across Asia and the Pacific, hungry for resources, and the one thing standing in its way was the American Navy. So Japan made a staggering bet: knock out the USS, Pacific Fleet, in a single surprise blow, before America even declared war. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes descended on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In under 2 hours, Over 2,400 Americans were dead, battleships were burning in the water, and a nation that wanted nothing to do with this war wanted everything to do with it now. But Japan made two fatal mistakes. The American aircraft carriers, the ships that would actually win the Pacific, happened to be out at sea that day and survived, and the attack didn't break America's will. It united it overnight, and then, bizarrely, Hitler, who was under no obligation to do this, declared war on the United States anyway, just days later. So now the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, untouched, unbroken, with endless resources, was in the war. On the Allied side. Against him. The math of the entire war had just changed, and Hitler had helped change it. By 1942, the world was on fire on every continent, but the war's spine, the place where it would truly break, was a single city in the Soviet Union. Stalingrad. Hitler wanted it badly. Partly for its resources, partly because it carried Stalin's name. What followed was arguably the most brutal battle in human history. Not fought across open fields, but street by street, building by building, room by room. Snipers in the rubble, soldiers fighting for days over a single factory. Both sides feeding hundreds of thousands of men into a meat grinder that just kept turning. And then, the Soviets did to the Germans exactly what the Germans had done to everyone else. They surrounded them. An entire German army, trapped in the frozen ruins of the city it came to conquer, starving, out of ammunition, begging Hitler for permission to retreat. Hitler refused. "Stand and die," he ordered. So they died, and the survivors, nearly 100,000 of them, surrendered. Almost none ever came home. Stalingrad was the turning point of the entire war. Before it, Germany was advancing. After it, Germany was retreating, and it would retreat step by bloody step all the way back to Berlin. The same year, in the deserts of North Africa, the British and Americans crushed German and Italian forces and started squeezing from the south. The hunter had become the hunted. But to tell you about armies and battles and turning points without stopping here would be a lie, because the worst thing that happened in this war wasn't on any battlefield. As the Nazis conquered Europe, they carried out a plan they'd been building toward from the very beginning, the deliberate, industrial murder of Europe's Jews. It started with stripped rights and ghettos. It escalated to mass shootings behind the front lines, and it ended in death camps built for one purpose, to kill human beings as efficiently as factories build cars. By the end, around 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered. Alongside millions of others, the Nazis decided didn't deserve to live. This is the part the algorithm would rather I rush past. I won't, because this is why the rest of it matters. Every battle in this war, every soldier on every beach, was ultimately fighting against the machinery that produced this. When the Allied soldiers finally reached those camps, hardened men who had seen years of combat broke down at what they found. There are no clever lines for this. There's just the number and the responsibility to remember it. 6 million. Keep it with you for the rest of the story. By 1944, the Allies were ready to take Western Europe back, and it came down to a single, terrifying morning. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The largest seaborne invasion ever attempted. Before dawn, around 156,000 American, British, and Canadian troops crossed the storming English Channel toward 5 beaches in Nazi-occupied France, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines in the dark. Thousands of ships filled the horizon. The Germans had spent years fortifying these beaches. Bunkers, mines, machine guns aimed straight down at the sand. On most of the beaches, the Allies broke through with fewer losses than they'd feared. On one, Omaha, it was a slaughter. Men cut down before they cleared the ramps, the water turning red, wave after wave pushing forward into the guns anyway. And they held. By nightfall, against everything, the Allies had their foothold in France. From here, there was no turning them back. Paris was liberated. The Germans were driven out of France. The noose was tightening, Americans and British closing from the west, the enormous Soviet army grinding in from the east. Hitler's 1,000-year empire had maybe a year left. Hitler threw everything he had left into one last desperate gamble in the winter of 1944, a surprise attack through, of all places, the Ardennes again. The same forest trick that beat France. It created a bulge in the Allied line, which is why we call it the Battle of the Bulge. But this time, the Allies held, and it burned up the last of Germany's strength for nothing. After that, it was a collapse. The Allies poured into Germany from the west. The Soviets stormed in from the east, taking city after city, closing on the capital. And as they advanced, the full horror of the camps was revealed to the world. By April 1945, the Soviet army was in the streets of Berlin, and in a bunker deep beneath the city, the man who had set the whole world on fire, who had promised a glorious empire that would last 1,000 years, realized it was over. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself, hiding underground, as his capital burned above him. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered. In Europe, the war was finally over. But not everywhere. Across the Pacific, Japan was beaten but refused to surrender. The fighting had become almost unimaginably savage as the Americans fought island by island toward Japan itself, and every island cost more lives than the last. American commanders looked at the prospect of invading the Japanese mainland and saw a bloodbath that could cost 1 million lives. So instead, they used a weapon the world had never seen. On August 6, 1945, an American plane dropped a single atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. One bomb, one city, gone. 3 days later, a second fell on Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond anything in human history, and tens of thousands of civilians died instantly, with many more to follow. To this day, people argue fiercely about whether it was necessary or monstrous or both, and that's a debate worth having, honestly, not a question with a clean answer. Days later, Japan surrendered. And after 6 years, the deadliest war in the history of the human race was finally, completely over. So what did 60 million deaths buy? A world determined, again, to never do this again. But this time, trying to actually build something to prevent it. Out of the ashes came the United Nations, designed so the great powers would argue across a table instead of across a battlefield. Old enemies like France and Germany began tying their economies together so tightly that war between them became almost unthinkable. The seed that eventually grew into the European Union, the map of the modern world, the alliances you see on the news tonight, almost all of it was drawn in the wreckage of this war. But there's a darker echo too. Because notice how it started, not with a sudden invasion. It started with a humiliated country, a broken economy, and a man who told frightened people that all their problems were someone else's fault. Every warning sign was visible. Every single step could have been stopped. And the most powerful nations on earth watched it happen and told themselves it wasn't their problem, until it was everyone's problem. The First World War was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. 20 years later, it turned out to be the war that caused the next one. That's the thing about history. It doesn't repeat. But it absolutely rhymes, and the whole point of looking back is so you can hear it coming. I'm Hindsight. Thanks for watching, and if this is the kind of story you want more of, you know what to do.